Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here. It's lovely to be in an event where we can see people and greet people, which is good. An event which also is of great value in terms of debating where we are and reflecting on where we are with the politics in different parts of the UK. And of course, for everyone watching online, maybe later, it's good to have your company as well. I'm delighted to be chairing. I'd like to thank Anand and the team for asking me. There's a compelling logic to having this session, of all sessions, to tie up the panel sessions of the day before John Curtis appears a little later. And that's because, of course, lots of the debate has been dominated, understandably, by a predominantly, how can I put it, pan-British narrative to what's going on. And there's lots of reasons why that is valid. But of course, the whole point of this session is to underline that we're no longer in a single narrative running between two familiar tramlines. We are talking about several narratives, sometimes crisscrossing each other and sometimes affecting each other. And it's quite a complex process at times as well. And I say that as someone who often has to sit in an election studio, as I did last year, making sense of several stories and to try and explain where they meet, and to try and explain why some of them have affected others. And for a predominantly English audience, if I can say that, it's even more important because what we've discovered over the past few years through Brexit and through the pandemic is that we're having to, and we're doing it happily, of course, it's our duty, we're having to explain repeatedly what some of the differences are in legislative terms and in terms of powers and guidelines and rules, etc., in different parts of the UK. And the response from the audience in England, I'm saying it advisedly, is illuminating, because often with people grasping these things for the first time, the reactions vary from resentment to incredulity to, in some cases, envy, if they think things are going on which they're not part of or not benefiting from. All of those are an interesting part of the political dynamic that we are trying to unpick today. It's a combination, really, of Brexit and the pandemic which have brought those to the fore. I suppose the other thing I'd point out to, just before I introduce the four guests, is this whole concept of nationalism in British politics or UK politics. We're used to the nationalist dynamic, a very powerful one in Scotland. Northern Ireland, of course, has its own particular dynamic at work. And Wales, I'm saying this as impartially as I can, offers another interesting illustration, because you don't just have the traditionally nationalist Plaid Cymru grouping, but of course you have in Welsh Labour something that lots of people haven't clocked over the years. There's lots of a kind of latent Welsh nationalism lying behind Welsh Labour's way of going about its business and indeed governing over the last 20 years. So these nationalist forces, now dealing with what we can all agree, I think, is a kind of growing English nationalism in a more kind of broad sense, does present us with another challenging set of circumstances that we can talk about today. So that's the whole point of the discussion. What's the pattern of politics if we look in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland and England separately? So with that in mind, let me just introduce the panel. They'll all be known to you because their reputations precede them in every single case. Professor Richard Wyn-Jones, an old friend of mine, let me declare an interest. He is the Director of the Centre of Welsh Governance, Cardiff University, and is also Dean of Public Affairs at the university. I don't want to upset others by saying he's the preeminent commentator and analyst of Welsh politics, but I'm sure he'd be happy with that. Okay. Professor Ailsa Henderson, who is Professor of Political Science at the University of Edinburgh. I'm being extremely nice to Ailsa today, not least because, of course, she's a star academic, a stellar academic in her own right, but she's also one of my son's tutors at Edinburgh, so she is to be treated with kid gloves. And any unkind questions on the Slido to Ailsa will be, I'm sorry to say this, deleted. Professor John Tongue is with us, who's Professor of Politics at the University of Liverpool, another of our distinguished commentators on the political trends of the moment. I'm delighted that John's joined us. And, of course, from my own journalistic backyard as well, though in press terms and online terms, we have Alvarea, who's the political correspondent of the New Statesman and a proper star in the making there. Already a star on the New Statesman, but with a fantastic landscape to be filling ahead of us. So it's good to have you with us, Alva, too. Can we give them a warm welcome? Thank you very much indeed. Right, this is what I'd like to do. We'll have 4 presentations. They'll be, of course, they'll be concise. And of course, they'll be whipping along at some speed, and they will delight us with the content. So 4 presentations. We're doing Richard and John first. Richard first, then John, because they have slides, and then Ilse and Alva after that. And after the 4 presentations, we will then open it up for what I hope will be a really good discussion and a good go at some of the issues involved. So let's start. Richard, diolch yn fawr I ti.
Diolch yn fawr. Good afternoon, everybody. Even before the Brexit referendum, it was clear that the fate of the external union with Europe was linked to that of the internal union, that is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. You'll recall John Major and Tony Blair warning explicitly that a vote for Brexit would destabilise the position of Northern Ireland and threaten the gains of the peace process. Meanwhile, Boris Johnson, in his, at the time, unpublished pro-Remain tract, you'll recall that he wrote an article saying why you should vote Remain and vote Leave. He warned in the pro-Remain tract, and I quote, "An English-only Leave vote could lead to the breakup of the Union," said Boris Johnson. Now, in this, at least, all 3 Prime Ministers were correct. Brexit, in particular, the ways that successive UK governments have interpreted the implications of the referendum vote, has destabilised the internal union. The high politics of this are obvious to all. The Northern Ireland Protocol and all that, the new laws in terms of relationships between devolved and central government. But what I want to do in what follows is dig a little deeper and focus on the ways that Brexit appears to be impacting not only on attitudes, but even on identities in Wales. Why Wales? Not only because I want, obviously, Hugh Edwards to feel at home. We know that attitudes to Brexit in Wales were closely related to senses of national identity. It's true throughout the UK, but it's also true in Wales. But we also know that more generally that in Wales, attitudes towards devolution are also closely tied to senses of national identity. Indeed, even the same is true of partisan choice in Wales, which explains to a very significant extent why this year, the 15th of November, to be precise, will mark the century of Labour winning every significant national election in Wales, which is quite something. Some people were talking about one-partyism earlier. I thought, you've got no idea. Anyway, as such, Wales is the ideal place to see how these dynamics potentially intersect, right? And of course, Wales was never part of the warnings about Brexit and the Union. Wales wasn't part of those. It was Northern Ireland, Scotland. So if it's happening in Wales, then, arguably something very significant is going on. So now, this slide is far too busy, and I'm going to be slide shamed when I get back to Cardiff, because my younger colleagues will be telling me that this is horrible. But I just want to start. So if you kind of focus on the middle of that and the percentage leave vote, I just want to remind us of how national identities were related to attitudes towards the European Union. And as Hugh alluded to earlier, Wales is demographically really complicated, because you've got a big block of people living in Wales who feel English, as well as a big block of people who feel Welsh, obviously. So just to recap the story, and if you've been following our work over the past 4 or 5 years, you'll know all of this already. If you haven't been following, then I think this might be a lot to take in. But just very briefly, in Wales, in terms of the 2 territorial non-state identities that matter in Wales, i.e. Welshness and Englishness, both were strongly correlated with attitudes towards Brexit, but in opposite directions. So Welsh identity, like Scottish identity in Scotland, was significantly related to pro-Remain sentiment, with Welsh speakers tending to be a particularly Europhile group within that kind of group of Welsh identifiers. Meanwhile, those who identified as English in Wales had very, very similar views to English identifiers in England, i.e. they tended to be strongly Eurosceptic. The impact of statewide identity then varied depending on which of the territorial identities it was intersecting or interacting with. So those who felt both strongly Welsh and strongly British, or who had a strong claim to Welsh identity, for example, were born in Wales, which is what we've got here, but chose to identify only as British, tended to be significantly more Eurosceptic than those who felt strongly Welsh only, which again is repeating a pattern that we find in Scotland, actually. Meanwhile, those who felt strongly English and strongly British, who had a strong claim to English identity because they were born in England, for example, but chose to identify only as British, they behaved in an almost identical way to the same groups in England. And in the latter case, in the case of the British, not English, that meant that they tended to be pro-Remain. So that was the story, and it'll be a familiar story to those of you who've taken any interest. What's happened since, and what I want you to focus on then, is towards the right-hand side of this table. And what I want you to focus on is on the size of the national identity groups and the way that they've changed in the 5 years between 2016 and 2021. And what we see is that the proportions of the electorate identifying as either Welsh British or English British have fallen. The Welsh British fallen quite significantly, actually. And it's meant that now the Welsh only group, which has grown, as has the British only, not English group, the Welsh only group is now the largest identity group in Wales, which wasn't the case 5 years ago. Now, this raises, I think, a really intriguing possibility. Given that Brexit has been revealed ever more clearly as a national project, that is, a project that seeks to undergird and project a particular understanding of a national past, present and potential future, to what extent are we seeing those people who reject that national project also rejecting the national identities that associate most closely with that project? After all, in the UK, where you've got potentially dual or nested identities, I could identify as Welsh or British or both. More of a stretch for me to identify as English, as you might imagine from my accent, but we've got options, okay? So, are people, in a sense, reassessing their sense of national identity? And indeed, if you look under the bonnet of these data, it's Remainers who are shifting from the Welsh-British category or the English-British category to a kind of national fit that works better for them. So in this sense, we need to see if this is replicated elsewhere, but there's certainly some quite striking evidence in Wales that, you're seeing even a shift in senses of national identity. I mentioned national project. This segues into consideration of attitudes towards devolution. Support for which in the Welsh context has always been strongly correlated with national identity. Now, in the aftermath of the 2016 referendum, it was widely assumed by partisans on both sides of the divide that the majority votes in favour of Brexit in Wales presaged a weakening in the public legitimacy of devolution. Indeed, those of you who follow these things will recall that in the run-up to last May's devolved election, Wales's right-wing populists shifted in a strongly Devo-sceptic direction, viewing this as the kind of natural corollary of Euroscepticism. But what we show here is shows shifts in attitudes towards devolution, again over 5 years, using the same identity groups that I was referring to earlier. And what you can see is that whatever the expectations, we've seen almost all of the national identity groups shifting in a more pro-autonomy direction, if from very strong, really different starting points. So while devolution clearly remains a national project, and while there are some that see that national project as locked in an existential struggle with the other national project that is Brexit, public attitudes are not so easily corralled. And that's before we get to COVID, which, as Hugh rightly mentioned, has changed things yet further. The question remains, however, how will the electorate respond if the UK government continues on its current path, namely reducing the competences of devolved government in core areas of activity like in economic development in order to, as it would claim, secure the benefits of Brexit. Now, in the most recent wave of the Welsh election study, we sought to explore this question directly. And the results, and this is in the publication that you've been given today, these results, I think, will make very uncomfortable reading for the Wales Office and the Welsh Conservatives. Because while it will come as no surprise that an overwhelming majority of Remainers in Wales reject the notion of reducing devolved powers in order to secure the benefits of Brexit, this view is also shared by a narrow majority of Welsh Leavers too. And of course, it's 52%, isn't it? So while abandoning the external union with Europe was always going to raise fundamental questions for the internal union of the UK, the way that successive UK governments have chosen to interpret the 2016 mandate has, in my view, only served to make those questions even more intractable. Yes, even in apparently docile Brexit voting Wales. Thank you.
Richard, diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much, Richard. Again, keep the questions coming in. There are quite a few on my screen coming in now. And then I'll try and be as inclusive as I can in terms of using as many as possible when we come to the questioning. John, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much indeed. You'll see the title of the presentation there, Protocol, Problems and Polls. This is fairly heavy on the problems, I'm afraid, that are coming, some of which were flagged up by Sam Coates in the previous session. If we look at the looming Assembly election, there are three really interlinked questions and one further down the track here. Firstly, what sort of compromise can Liz Truss and Maros Sefcovic come to on the EU Northern Ireland Protocol? Because if there isn't a compromise, if there isn't a deal, then we probably have the gravest crisis for Northern Ireland's political institutions since the last one, which wasn't that long ago either. Can a governing executive be restored after this May's Northern Ireland Assembly election? And linked to that as well is the question, which may pose broader questions about the future of Northern Ireland's status within the United Kingdom, whether Sinn Féin will become the largest party at that election and thus be able to nominate for First Minister. And you can co-badge First and Deputy First Minister all you like in Northern Ireland. They are co-equals, but there's a reason 20-odd years after the Good Friday Agreement why they've still not been called co-First Ministers, and that's because in status terms, First Minister may matter in symbolic terms at least. First Minister matters perhaps more than Deputy First Minister. And that leads on to the wider question, is a border poll on the horizon, as some people would claim in respect of Northern Ireland. So let's deal with the current bleakish, I've given myself some wriggle room here, bleakish scenario. The executive has been missing in action quite a lot, really, ever since the Good Friday Agreement. 38% of the time it's been missing, so there's nothing new in one sense. You know, if you're looking at the Good Friday Agreement and giving it a grade as a student essay, you give it a first as a peace deal, but you might give it a lower second as a deal in terms of its political stability. And the DUP withdrew the First Minister, Paul Given, not that long ago, and that withdrawal brought down the executive as a collective. You still have ministers in place in Northern Ireland, but they are doing solo runs in effect as ministers. There is no collective government now in Northern Ireland. And so the obvious question begged is, what happens after the 5th of May? Will we get collective government back in Northern Ireland? And that begs the obvious question. Well, if the DUP is prepared to withdraw its First Minister this side of the election, why on earth would the DUP nominate a First Minister or, as seems quite probable, a Deputy First Minister, the DUP operating in reduced circumstances after that election, if the protocol is not resolved to the DUP's satisfaction? So again, it comes back to this notion of where does the compromise lie? So Geoffrey Donaldson, as leader of the DUP, has said that he wants, quote, meaningful reform of the protocol, a term that's not been fully quantified. He says he wants to get rid of the Irish sea border element of that protocol. That may involve a situation, without getting bogged down in detail, of goods that are going from Great Britain to Northern Ireland that are not going on to the Irish Republic, not going south of the border, being treated purely as UK goods. But that would mean quite a substantial rewriting of the protocol as it stands. So there is scope for compromise. Without a compromise, it's difficult to see the DUP nominating either a First or a Deputy First Minister anytime soon. So you might think, well, does that matter? Let the next Unionist Party, let them be the new kids on the block, let the Ulster Unionist Party nominate. But if you look legally at the St Andrews Agreement, which was the sort of modification of the Good Friday Agreement, it's not that simple legally. And I've talked to a good lawyer about this as to whether the right to nominate a deputy or a First Minister could be transferred to the next largest Unionist Party. He thinks not, and it may well be subject to legal challenge. But if it does simply rest with the DUP and they refuse to nominate, then where do we go from here? Now, what the Secretary of State has done, Brandon Lewis, is to introduce new legislation at Westminster to buy some time on this. So the parties will have 24 weeks. So those of you academics here who are lucky enough to have their election done and dusted by the 6th of May, some of us might keep going till nearly Halloween here before we actually get a new executive in Northern Ireland, and that's if we're lucky. So who's going to win this election is probably why many of you may be here. And if you look at the latest opinion polls in Northern Ireland, they've been pretty constant over the last year. There hasn't been a great deal of fluctuation, not that many pollsters, as it should be said, in Northern Ireland. The main lines to look at here are the green line at the top, Sinn Féin, and look at the consistency of Sinn Féin support over the last year. And then you see the DUP, the red line below that, trailing Sinn Féin. There's no sign, really, of the DUP, although they've recovered from the leadership mess they had last summer. They've only got a one-seat margin over Sinn Féin as it stands. A lot of the DUP seats are safe, so a 4% first preference lead for the Sinn Féin over the DUP is not it's not unwinnable for the DUP, but it's difficult given where they are. And if you look at this in a tabular form, look at the two columns in bold on the right-hand side here, the poll of polls, admittedly an unscientific way of tackling this issue. But Sinn Féin are at 24, Sinn Féin on 24% in the poll of polls. It's not that Sinn Féin are piling on votes. They're down 4 from where they were at the last Assembly election. But if you look, the big change there, the DUP down 9. And although I still think the DUP can do somewhat better than these polls indicate, you could very much have a Sinn Féin First Minister at the end of the story, and that will, I think, raise substantial questions over the future of the political institutions, given that devolved power sharing is at the heart of the Good Friday Agreement. One other thing to notice there as well is the rise of the Alliance Party, which has been doing well in recent elections, avowedly neutral on the future of the Union. They pledge constitutional neutrality, and they may well take a significant third place. So, in terms of that constitutional question, that broader constitutional question, and where the election might take us, it's perhaps better to say a couple of things first. Okay, firstly, there's a sort of lazy assumption that Brexit created a one-way street towards a united Ireland. That was always mythical. The idea that Unionists would wake up one morning and think, well, actually, now, because of Brexit, and a substantial proportion of Unionists voted Remain, about 40% of Unionists at its worth voted Remain. There was far less unanimity amongst Unionists than there was amongst nationalists. 85% of nationalists voted Remain, but only 40% of Unionists voted Remain. But Unionists were never going to become nationalists. What you've seen is a slump in support for the Union. If you look at the percentage of people who want Northern Ireland to remain in the United Kingdom, if you look at the poll of polls there in front of you, it's only at 50% in 2021. It's a far from overwhelming or convincing level of support for the continuation of Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom. But that's not to say that there's been a huge drive in support for a United Ireland. There was a post-Brexit move of around 10%, 11% increase in support for a United Ireland, but things have remained fairly stable since. You might think, well, if you look at those figures at the bottom, the 2021 figures, 50 plus 39, there's 11%. And there are about 11% of people who say they don't know. And it's those constitutional agnostics, many of whom are now voting for the Alliance Party. It is those who will ultimately decide the future of Northern Ireland's position within the United Kingdom. There's all to play for in terms of those. They tend to be young people. The younger you are, the less likely you are to vote, though, but they may well turn up on border poll day. But border poll day, just to finish off, is still some way off, because there's only one person that can call a border poll, and that's the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. It's up to the Secretary of State to call a referendum when he, and I'm using the language of the Good Friday Agreement there, he decides that a majority of those voting would express a wish that Northern Ireland should cease to be a part of the United Kingdom and form part of the United Ireland. Nationalists have tried to nationalists in particular, not exclusively nationalists, I should say, have tried to pin down better criteria, clearer criteria as to how the Secretary of State will make that judgment. Would he or she use opinion polls? Would they look at the size of block votes, unionist or nationalist block votes? But attempts to get a greater criteria, I should say, attempts to create a much clearer criteria have been dismissed in the courts. Mr. Justice Girvan, the quote's there in front of you. The precise circumstances basically will remain with the Secretary of State. It's up to the Secretary of State to decide when there's going to be a border poll. And I can tell you now, Brandon Lewis is far more worried about just trying to get a devolved executive back to Northern Ireland before he even starts thinking about any border poll anytime soon. Thank you.
John May, thanks. A commendable trip through what I think we can all agree is, let's just say, a challenging area of policy. Yeah. So, John, thanks very much for that. Elsa, the picture in Scotland.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm going to take a slightly different approach to this. I'm going to try and locate Scotland within the wider arguments about what we know about British politics. So this is part kind of British politics as seen from Scotland, and partly also just a look at Scottish politics itself. And in my allotted time, I want to make 4 points. The first is that in the UK, we aren't really having often the same political debate in different parts of the state. We are, in fact, often having 4 different debates in the 4 different territories of the UK, informed at times by different political preferences. And on occasion, when we are having the same argument and are having the same debate, we're sometimes coming to different conclusions. We find the electorates find themselves on different sides of that argument, and Brexit is an obvious example there. And that's not unusual. That's a function of having a multi-level state, but it is a fact that is typically ignored by 3 important actors. The first is that it is typically ignored by the UK government itself, which is at best opaque about when it acts for England and when it is acting for the whole of the UK. And there's lots of different ways you could look for evidence of this, but if you just look at the COVID press conferences, for example, and the frequency with which the other First Ministers were mentioned, or variation in terms of approaches was mentioned, it doesn't have a great record there. So it's certainly squeamish about highlighting when it acts for England alone. I think the media is important there, and Ofcom rebuked media commentators for failing to capture the multi-level reality and the multinational reality of the UK COVID experience in May of 2020. But I think another critical actor here are academic analysts, to be honest, who often make arguments about what is going on in Britain on the back of data that are overwhelmingly England-dominated, and make the case that this is what explains the way people think in Britain, when that's not true. It's how people think in England. And often if you hold up those arguments and examine them in Wales or you examine them in Scotland, Northern Ireland, they don't even attempt to try to see whether the argument holds there, then you find, in fact, that it's often a very specific English argument. Sometimes you get analysis that chucks in a kind of dummy variable for different parts of the UK as a way to get around it. But I always find it particularly frustrating if I come across analysis that has British identity in there as a variable, as if British identity works for English voters the same way that it works for Scottish voters or the way that it works for voters in Wales. So the failure to treat the United Kingdom as a multi-level state, let alone a plurinational state, is in fact one of the defining features of the analysis of the action of British politics, but also the analysis of British politics, I would argue. The second thing I want to say is that British identity works in different ways in different parts of the state. It has different predictors. So the people that describe themselves as British, they are different kinds of people. If you're looking for British identifiers in England versus Scotland versus Wales and versus Northern Ireland, but also those who prioritize their British identity, that identity aligns with very different attitudes depending on where in the UK you live, even where in Britain you live. And Remain and Leave are the obvious examples. So Richard mentioned earlier the Welsh example, but we know that British identifiers in England voted Remain, but British identifiers in Scotland and Wales voted Leave. But it's not just Brexit. It also attaches to attitudes to devolution. So some of the most supportive people in England about devolution are British identifiers. But those who are least supportive of devolution, certainly in Scotland and to a certain extent in Wales, are British identifiers. So British identity is different types of people who describe themselves this way, depending where you are, but also those people who prioritize their British identity, they have different attitudes and different preferences. And that's already layered on to different debates about whether there are, in fact, different values in different parts of the state, whether it's just a perception that we have different values or whether we actually have different values, or a slightly related debate about whether we have the same values but just come to different conclusions at the ballot box. So I think there's two different things here going on. There's territorial differentiation in terms of political behavior, in terms of attitudes, and in terms of identities, but critically also the relationship among those identities and attitudes and behaviors. Third thing I want to say is I think if we're looking at British politics, it's helpful to conceive of the union as a union of the mind. So lots of people analyze different states to see how decentralized they are in their structures. I think we would argue that it's also possible to think of how electorates conceive of the union that they're in. And if you think of the United Kingdom as a union of the mind, where there is a union of identity and a union of economic solidarity, a union of fairness and legitimacy, and a union of social solidarity, then the news is mixed. In no part of mainland Britain, in our data, is British identity the clear majority preference of the electorate. Scottish identity is streets ahead in Scotland. There's a similar gap in the same direction, if not smaller, if a smaller gap in Wales, with Welsh identity preferred over a British identity. And in England, it's in our data a dead heat between the proportion that would, if they had to pick, would describe themselves as English or describe themselves as British. In terms of economic solidarity, there's support in principle, but if you start asking people, well, what about sharing with this particular part of the union, then we find that support falls. In terms of fairness and legitimacy, the news is not particularly encouraging. Voters believe that there is an unfair distribution both of resources, but also of influence across the union. And in fact, the only really unambiguously positive news is in terms of social solidarity, where there is a clear reserve of strong UK-wide social solidarity and an expectation that we would have access to the same social rights across the state. And all of that, I think, is relevant because it feeds into a notion of ambivalent unionism. So we know that in different parts of the state, there are people who support independence or similar forms of radical constitutional change. But I think what's important to understand where we are in the United Kingdom at the moment is not just looking at people who want independence for their own part, but people who would believe that have a kind of so be it attitude if one or more other parts of the UK go their own way. And if you add together the proportion wanting independence and the proportion with this kind of ambivalent unionist attitude, then of those with an opinion, you're over half the electorate in every single part of the UK. Right? So there's a tremendous sense of ambivalence from the electorate about the current structure of the union. And I think that's important because that ambivalence on the part of the electorate is paired with, on the part of the UK government and pro-union political parties, not an approach that would be described as ambivalent unionism, but one that is better described as one of muscular unionism. And it's a term I started using to describe the Scottish Labour Party, actually, but it's been picked up and used as a way to explain what's going on in the United Kingdom. So you've got these different approaches that, well, we'll spend to pacify those who are concerned about the union. We'll just assert the benefits of the union rather than listening when people have concerns. That approach fits very uneasily with a kind of ambivalent unionist approach within the electorate as a whole. In terms of my fourth point, last point, what does this all mean in terms of Scottish attitudes? I can talk in the question and answers about what might happen in the local elections this year. There's a couple things to say. First, obviously, there's two constitutional issues at play in Scotland. There's the issue of independence and the issue of Brexit, and that has led to 4 constitutional tribes in Scotland: yes Remainers, yes Leavers, no Remainers, no Leavers. And the size of those has been shifting since 2016. The modal voter in Scotland after 2016 was a no Remainer, but the modal voter now in Scotland is a yes supporting Remainer. And in the report, 2 of my Scottish election study colleagues kind of analysed that in greater depth. Another thing that's relevant in terms of understanding Scottish preferences is this notion, I would argue, of a kind of form of nationalist valence politics. So it's not just partisan identification that helps to explain why people vote the way they do, but also national identity and constitutional identity as well. So in another chapter in the report, another one of my SCS colleagues is talking about the fact that 90% of Scottish voters back parties that align with their constitutional preference, but the strength of that identity also matters. And I think that is important because it's not just identities that are driving voting behaviour, but we also know that the salience of the constitutional issue means that standing up for the nation has become a valence issue. And the SNP are clearly seen to be the issue owners in terms of that valence issue. So constitutional preferences, do you want independence? That's a positional issue, but standing up for Scotland is a valence issue. And pro-union parties have been devoting their attention to attacking the SNP on the positional issue of independence, but not the valence issue of standing up for Scotland. And I think that confers a natural advantage to the SNP in any electoral context that works on top of the existing advantage of the fact that their constitutional preferences seem to align better with what we're seeing in terms of the electorate's preferences on independence.
So thank you very much. I was about to say, I'm now getting a headache because there are so many questions that I'm already panicking about the question session. And 1 or 2 people are getting rather worked up about the fact that some questions haven't been asked. So I'll try to deal with them, okay? In my own impartial kind of way. Yes, we'll do our best. So keep them coming in because they will relate again to the individual presentations, but the questions so far are really good, so it'll easily keep a very good debate going after the 4 presentations. When we think about a publication like the New Statesman, Alva, I'm just thinking where you touch on all of these areas, and then you have a take which is to put lots of these policy areas and the kind of changes we've been talking about in a Westminster context, in the way that you have the kind of friction that exists between certainly this government and the way it's handled some of the devolution settlement and some of the views that have been attributed to the Prime Minister himself about the wisdom or otherwise of the devolution settlement. What's your take on all of that?
Thank you. It's great to be here and to speak after such an illustrious panel. I'm going to begin actually by sort of explaining who I am, if that helps. You touched on it. So my name's Alva. I work across the road in Westminster. I'm the New Statesman's political correspondent. I cover Westminster politics day in, day out, and it's also a big editorial principle of the New Statesman that we cover devolved politics and take that seriously, which I hope is obvious for our coverage, but it is a challenge because, as Elsa talked about, there is a consistent failure to reckon with the UK as a multi-level state, and from Westminster it's really challenging to cover all the different layers of government, devolved and otherwise. But I'm also from Belfast and often find that I'm asked to speak about Northern Irish politics in particular, and I also find that I regularly despair at the poor level of literacy on Northern Irish politics in our public debate and around Westminster. So I kind of anticipated speaking mostly about Northern Ireland today, but from that vantage point of being both Northern Irish and working in the cut and thrust of Westminster. And I feel like that's maybe helpful because John covered a lot of it expertly, but probably Northern Ireland does require 2 presentations. So I thought I would kind of pick up where John left off, and I think I'll answer your question while I do it. Because I suppose the question we're all wondering about Northern Ireland is whether a border poll is inevitable, and off the back of that, whether Irish unity is inevitable. And if you really take a step back, last year marked 100 years since the creation of Northern Ireland, and even at that point, it didn't necessarily look like that would be a stable entity forever. The border was designed to create a natural unionist majority, but over time that has waned. And if you were to take a very long view, you would say, well, inevitably at some stage that unionist majority will disappear, and inevitably Ireland will be reunited. But then you zone in again, and no one really talks that way about Northern Irish politics. And even in the wake of Brexit, that is not necessarily what has been happening. And the reality is much more interesting, really, if you're interested in politics, and also much less fatalistic, because it's an important principle of the Good Friday Agreement, not to just talk in terms of demographic inevitabilities, but the idea that Northern Irish people have a right to decide for themselves what happens there, and so that remains a free choice when it gets put to the people of Northern Ireland, if it gets put. So the interesting thing that John mentioned in his presentation, one of the most interesting things, I think, are what John referred to as the constitutional agnostics, but also known as the unaligned middle, or basically the don't knows. So as we look at those demographic trends in Northern Ireland, that unionist majority waning, you're not necessarily seeing that being replaced by a nationalist majority. It's not necessarily converting easily into suddenly a majority for a united Ireland. What you're instead seeing in the wake of the Good Friday Agreement and a different settlement, and just sort of the waning influence of religion and so many other factors, immigration, there's this big, increasingly, this growing demographic of people who don't know how they would vote anymore in a border poll. And that's a lot of people like me, younger people from more middle-class backgrounds, people who attended a mixed school in some examples, but also other more interesting demographics like middle-class Protestant women who are maybe, you can speculate, who are maybe disillusioned with the state of unionist politics. So it means that we're at a state where a border poll is still not likely to be called. It's within the gift of Brandon Lewis, and the indicators aren't there yet that a majority would vote in favour of United Ireland were a border poll to happen. But the rumblings are already happening that a border poll could happen soon, and that we're inching that way. And it's a political debate in itself about how much we should be talking about that. And because I suppose the thing just over the horizon in this discussion, it's not part of the UK, but that is quite important in these discussions, is also what's happening in the Republic of Ireland, where Sinn Féin is likely to be the largest party in the next election. And we're probably looking at a situation very soon where Sinn Féin could likely be in power in north and south. And suddenly, I think a lot of people who watch, lots of people watching Irish politics from England will suddenly be reckoning with Sinn Féin in power north and south in Ireland. What does that mean? Sinn Féin have already been making a big push for preparations for discussions around a border poll, and they've been making a kind of conciliatory case that unionists should also be involved in that conversation, that can be, a sort of a non-hostile conversation. But most unionists basically don't want that conversation to even be happening and won't even give ground on that. And even there, that's incredibly sensitive and tricky. That's one thing, but then it's really hard to talk about this without then coming back to the theme of all of today, which is Brexit and what Brexit has done to all of these latent trends. And I think really what we've seen is that Brexit has really poured fuel on the fire and has disrupted the sort of already shaking sands of Northern Irish politics, because this sort of underlying anxiety in the unionist community that eventually their power in Northern Irish politics is slowly waning, their natural majority is also waning. This feeling that there have been concessions made to nationalist communities in ways big and small around policing or other policy areas. These have all been catalysed by the imposition of a border down the Irish Sea, which Boris Johnson promised not to do. And it's hard to talk about this fairly. I sometimes get in trouble with people on the nationalist side of things if I do an event like this, because they say, well, we didn't ask for Brexit, and so the protocol is not our fault, and these problems are caused by Brexit and not by the protocol, which is also all true, but it's just an uncomfortable fact that it is a slap in the face for anyone with a British identity in Northern Ireland, that there is a border imposed right down the middle of their own country. And we've seen, recent spates of violence, and it's difficult when we're having these conversations about the future of Northern Ireland to know how much space to give that. And indeed, I think it's a question for Liz Truss, and the question of whether to trigger Article 16, whether that kind of violence and unrest will end up being rewarded by taking massive action like triggering Article 16. So it really just means that Brexit has highlighted and stirred up feelings and anxieties that were already there. And that has just manifested actually conversely in a slight collapse in support for the biggest unionist party. There's so much latent anxiety, but it's being directed in all these different directions now, and it isn't coalescing around support for the big unionist player. So we're in a situation now where we have these elections coming up. We're also hearing rumblings again of potentially Article 16 being triggered. And then that's nothing to do with Northern Ireland. That comes back to Boris Johnson, because in a way the story ends far away from Northern Ireland, but the instability of Boris Johnson's position as Prime Minister, as he's already done a mini reshuffle. He's already sort of shaken up his team in Downing Street. He's making a show of statesmanship on Ukraine. But, sitting in Westminster as someone with a very big interest in Northern Irish politics, the thing, I'm talking to Tory MPs all the time about how they feel about things and how secure his position is. And one of the last levers that he can pull, really, is to trigger Article 16 to shore up support on his right flank, because the ERG would love to see Article 16 be triggered, and a case being made internally by Boris Johnson's supporters is that actually one of the main reasons to keep him in place is that there's no guarantee a Rishi Sunak Prime Minister would be as hardline on Brexit. So it seems likely, I think you can tell that on the European side and among the Northern Irish parties, they're braced again for Article 16 to be triggered. And whether that happens or not, especially with that intersecting with Ukraine, is not completely clear. But it means that today, because Westminster politics moves so fast, it means that today we're looking at a situation where we're talking about the future of the UK. We're talking about whether a United Ireland is in any way likely. But really, we're thinking about whether Boris Johnson is going to trigger Article 16, whether he's going to cause that instability in Northern Ireland, whether he's going to trigger a trade war with the European Union to save his own premiership. So aside from all of the immediate questions that poses, then the big question that I would sort of leave you with is what does that do for people making a decision about whether to stay in the UK or not, if this is how Northern Ireland is governed from Westminster? Because again, you take that long view since the border was imposed and all the problems that there have been in Northern Ireland since the Good Friday Agreement, the approach of the UK government has really been to act as an honest broker and to maintain the fragile peace. But recently, I make no comment on whether this is a good idea or not, but the government has taken a more partisan stake in Northern Irish politics, has taken a pro-Brexit position and a more explicitly unionist position, which was always implied but not so much asserted since the Good Friday Agreement. So this unaligned middle, looking at how Boris Johnson's government has approached decisions around Northern Ireland, what are they going to think if Article 16 is triggered, or taking a longer view of the decisions that have been made in relation to Brexit for Northern Ireland? I think that even though Northern Ireland is not considered so much when people are thinking about how Boris Johnson's premiership is shored up, actually the two are just massively interlinked. I'm going to leave you with that. Thank you.
Alva, thank you so much. Thank you very much. Really insightful and useful. Talk us through the issues then to build on what John was telling us, so thank you so much. Just picking up on that, by the way, can I just say this to you in the friendliest possible way? If anybody else tries to remind me of Paul Giles's question, I shall not ask it, okay? So any more reminders, bearing in mind that I'm a latecomer today and I'm already losing my patience. I will include Paul's question before the end of the session, unless I get another reminder, in which case I'm doing a little, I think it's actually just a little slide to the left on my screen, okay? And it's a red line that goes through it. So, okay, thank you very much. Let's just deal with Northern Ireland to start, because you've had two things there, and then I'll bring you both in, okay? Because there are related issues, obviously. What happens to that dynamic between Westminster and the island of Ireland if you have Sinn Féin in power in Dublin and if you have a Sinn Féin First Minister eventually in Belfast? What is the likely response of a government led, for example, by Boris Johnson? How is it going to handle that position? Either of you.
I think that there is anxiety among senior Conservatives who aren't in the current government, former cabinet ministers, that this is just not a question that Boris Johnson's government has been paying much attention to. And so there are senior Conservatives trying to maintain that link between the Conservative Party and Sinn Féin because they don't see anyone in government doing it. So there are residual links there. I mean, I gather that Liz Truss and Michelle O'Neill, the Deputy First Minister in Northern Ireland, for example, do have a very warm personal relationship because years ago they were both on the culture brief, and that's quite a warm relationship. But I think that there's a sense that there's no foresight, no planning ahead. People are quite worried about that, and I think there's a sense within Boris Johnson's government. I think so often there's a trend when we talk about Brexit of the civil servants and the ministers being at odds. I think you hear frustration from Boris Johnson's government that the NIO are just full of Sinn Féin sympathisers, or that the inclination of the British civil service at the moment is to appease Sinn Féin, and Boris Johnson's government want to stick up to that. So I think it's really unclear how they would adjust to that change, and they're not prepared for it. And that's really that's my only feeling so far.
John, your thoughts?
Yeah, just three quick points on this. Firstly, in terms of the broader context, British-Irish relationships have never been as poor for a long, long time. They'd improved progressively almost from the day they joined the EEC as was together in January 1973. They've deteriorated a great deal. On the Irish side, there's an incomprehension. I've heard this directly from the Taoiseach on Brexit. He just doesn't get Brexit. So there's a problem with British-Irish relations. In terms of Sinn Féin being the largest party in both jurisdictions, which I certainly think is looming, that will increase the pressure, obviously, for a border poll. The Secretary of State still has the get-out that he may not think that majority opinion in the north is sufficient to trigger that poll, but clearly, if you've got Sinn Féin as the largest party in government in both jurisdictions, that does increase the pressure. Thirdly, I agree with Olba on Article 16. That's the one card the British government can play. It may be a dangerous card, but it could play that would potentially restore the devolved government in the sense the DUP would be quite impressed by that, and therefore they go back into government regardless of the election result on the 5th of May. So that does buy more time, but it is a dangerous game to play.
Question, just again, can I just pick up, because I don't want to lose the thread here, okay? And again, to both of you, maybe John first, will it be beneficial to invoke Article 16 as soon as possible, but specifically before the coming elections, so it's a fait accompli by that point?
Yeah, I think there's a distinct possibility that Article 16 will be invoked for that tactical reason, to keep Unionists on side. Unionists are divided. The Ulster Unionist Party does not think that collapsing the executive is a good idea, but the DUP palpably does, and has gone ahead and actually collapsed the executive. And it may be the only thing that will actually get the DUP back into the devolved executive. It will still be quite a hard sell for the DUP if they are the second largest party to nominate a deputy first minister. Geoffrey Donaldson's not giving up a seat at Westminster to come back and be deputy first minister. He wants to be first minister. But people will turn around and say to the DUP, well, it's very undemocratic if you now won't go into government just because you're no longer top dog. So there's an awful lot at stake at this election.
There was a little follow-on, if I can put this to you, Alva, which was, is there any Sinn Féin politician that the Unionists are more likely to trust?
I think, well, the thing is, I'm not sure people realise this, but Sinn Féin don't take their seats in Westminster, but if you go across to Portcullis House right now, they are all still sitting in Portcullis House having coffee. They just don't take their actual seats, but they're still there. So I think the relationship between the government and Sinn Féin is not really there. But still, Sinn Féin MPs are a bit of a presence in Westminster. They're just not as well known because they're not seen in the chamber. But I think that Michelle O'Neill and Mary Lou MacDonald are felt to be quite, easy to work with. But there's this thing again. It's difficult talking about Irish and Northern Irish politics to know how much space to give this, but there is often a sense that you hear from British politicians that they're going back and conferring with, shady men in dark rooms in North Belfast. So I think that there's a sense of not feeling like you're necessarily dealing with those people alone when you deal with them. But also I think there are figures, if you're thinking about Sinn Féin in power north and south, there are Southern Irish politicians that will suddenly come into play. There are people like Owen O'Brien, who's a very respected housing spokesperson. Feel like very few people maybe in the room will be aware of him because he's not really a player in Northern Irish politics, but he's very senior in Sinn Féin and considered a rising star and quite, easy to work with. But even just MPs like John Finucane maybe would be people seen as easier to work with.
Thank you very much. Right, I want to move the focus to a question that's come up several times, and this is to do with the Internal Markets Bill. And the question comes up in several forms. So, Elsa and Richard, should it be seen, I'm paraphrasing quite a few of the questions, should it be seen as simply a crude attempt to weaken the devolution settlement? Elsa first.
No, I don't think that's its intent. I think it is... I'm trying to be diplomatic. I think it is another example of action that doesn't care much what the consequences of it are on devolution, partly from a lack of understanding I think, so sometimes when we look at what the UK government's doing and saying around, you know, when it acts for England and when it acts for UK, we're often thinking, is it that they don't know that they're only acting for England, or is it that they know and they're deliberately not saying? And I think a lot of how it treats devolution, and this is true both in the civil, there's lots of colleagues who do research on this in terms of the civil service. I think there are pockets of the civil service where devolution isn't quite understood as much as it might be, particularly given the amount of time that has passed. But I wouldn't label it as something that was designed to weaken the devolution settlement.
Okay.
It is perhaps possible to say that folks don't care all that much if it weakens the devolution settlement. But there is a certain cohort that are trying to close the barn door after the horse is bolted.
Okay. Richard, do you take a less or a more benign view?
Less. I think there is definitely just a lack of knowledge and structural lack of knowledge and engagement. And, you know, it's no surprise. Wales is 5% of the state. Scotland is 7%. Northern Ireland is 3%. They've all got different, in the Welsh case, often very complicated constitutional settlements, which change all the time. And so there's been this continual attempt to educate Whitehall. I've spoken at so many events close to here where kind of civil servants are pulled together and they're going to do a devolution education programme. And of course, you know that such as the churn in Whitehall, that these people are there for 7 months and then they're out and they've got to start again. So there's definitely that structural element to it. But also there's been in terms of the Conservative Party, and we discussed this in our contribution to the book that's been distributed today. I mean, the Conservatives have done a double reverse ferret on devolution. So they started off in '99 simply not accepting devolution. The first devolution election was fought by the Conservatives on basically we don't want this. They then shifted, and there was a very conscious attempt by the Conservatives to embrace devolution, to accept that devolution has happened, to say it's strengthened the union and that we're going to make this work, etc., etc. And you know that brought them back into the game in Wales because they lost every seat in Wales in the '97 general election. They didn't win any seats in Wales in the 2001 general election. Devolution got them back into the game in Wales, ironically enough. But what's happened over the last 5 years in particular is that the kind of pro-devolution element within the Welsh Conservative Party certainly has been silenced and actually left the Senedd, more or less. And increasingly, devolution is seen as an existential threat to the union. Rather than something to work with, it's seen as a threat in itself. And you see kind of all kinds of bizarre behaviour. So, you know, hearing Mark Drakeford being seen as second only to Nicola Sturgeon as a threat to the UK. I mean, really? You know, at the moment, in terms of the UK government is systematically trying to force local government and businesses in Wales to choose between London and Cardiff in terms of their interaction. You know, it's you know, I don't know what it's not statecraft. You know, it's you know, if you wanted to preserve the union, you'd be doing the exact opposite. But you know, they treat any idea of further powers, even if there's an argument for it, is seen as, you know, anathema. You know, thus far and no further, and we'll take it away if we can. So there's been a switch in attitudes, and it's not consistent. So there is this structural stuff, and sometimes people just overlook the complications. But I think there's something more going on underneath as well. Which
is troubling if you're thinking of the Smith Commission after the 2014 referendum. But whereas, you know, in that process you had clear delight at kind of, right, okay, we've got this vow, we're going to extend powers, we're going to expand dramatically devolution in Scotland. So you have these inconsistent, you know, we've spoken elsewhere about serial ad hocery, this kind of, we're going to solve the immediate problem, and that might leave us to radically enhance devolution. We're going to solve the next problem. Whoa, I think actually in this instance, we're going to radically roll it back. Okay, next problem. Oh, in that one, we have to radically move it forward. And that is connected to another point about just an absence of discussion about what are the first principles. What are the first principles of the state after devolution? Why are we here? What are we doing? What is the purpose of all of it?
Just one thought which connects to this. I mean, obviously, you know, at its most fundamental level, devolution isn't really consistent with the parliamentary sovereignty fetishism that Brexit has become. You know, it is, you know, okay, I know that all the devolution legislation says Westminster retains sovereignty, but, you know, what devolution does, it creates alternative centres of legitimacy and authority which Westminster can't easily corral. So, you know, it's not surprising that Brexiteers are often very, very hostile to the very principle of devolution.
So hold those thoughts, because we're going to turn the question slightly. And thanks, Mark, for this. What changes in policy, possibly rhetoric, but what changes in policy from the government, we're talking about UK government, and possibly Labour too, in terms of Keir Starmer, might slow the momentum towards Scottish independence, or demands for more Welsh autonomy, or indeed a united Ireland? So what kind of policies or rhetoric would really make a difference in the case that Boris Johnson claims he wants to make, which is for strengthening the Union as it stands? So who'd like to start there, first of all? You're all scribbling furiously. Yes, Ava.
Well, so I'd like to hazard a guess of an answer and then see what else and the rest of the panel make of this, because I suppose there's not fundamentally much that Boris Johnson and his government can really do. And it seems to me that the only way to reverse the trend towards Scottish independence would be for Labour to start winning in England again. I don't know what the people who devote, you know, their scholarly lives to this make of that idea, but I think that's the feeling in Westminster, that ultimately, just on a really basic level, if you keep electing an SNP government in Scotland and you get Tories in Westminster, you will feel disenfranchised. If you are electing Labour politicians in Scotland and they're in power at Westminster, then I think you feel more agency, and that's the thing that changes the trend. And I think that that's the same. A little bit, it's not the same, but I think maybe would change the feeling a little bit in Wales, and also in terms of Northern Ireland, because Labour has this deep tradition of taking pride in the Good Friday Agreement, which wasn't just a Labour achievement. John Major did so much work on that, but I think that they have retained this sense of wanting to be honest brokers on Northern Ireland, which would again, I think, settle those fears.
So, well, for an alleged casual answer, that was impressively cogent. Thank you very much. Elsa, just start with you, just in terms of the Scottish dynamic here. What could you imagine, you know, a Boris Johnson type government might be able to do in policy terms, or even say, if it's a matter of a kind of impressive or effective campaign, which might slow the momentum? Is there anything?
The single most important thing the Conservative Party could do is get a different leader. If it wants to slow the momentum of Scottish independence, I mean, it is. Many people are saying Scottish independence is an argument that's being made in London, not in Glasgow or Edinburgh or anywhere else. I mean, we knew before he became leader of the party that he was deeply unpopular in Scotland. 20% of no voters said they would switch to yes purely if he became leader. He is unpopular, and particularly so in Scotland, which is partly why his numbers have fallen fairly slowly in Scotland, because they were already so low to begin with. So in terms of the leader, that's the single most important thing. But you asked about policy, and that's a difficult one, because on the one hand, there's a clear challenge. We know that Brexit effects kind of soften the independence polarisation that's happening in Scotland. So if you think about how people feel about the SNP, yes, Leavers and yes, Remainers clearly prefer the SNP on all kinds of competence issues. And no Leavers clearly prefer the Conservative Party. But no Remainers slightly prefer the Conservative Party, for example, on education, but have the SNP right behind it. So you've got people who don't agree with the SNP on independence, but support its attitudes on Brexit and rate its competence pretty much in the same place as a party that has devoted the most attention to opposing independence in Scotland. And I think that helps to explain that nationalist valence thing that's going on. So Brexit provides a heck of an obstacle, because it is constraining the ability of the Conservative Party to capitalise on all the attention that it's put into opposing independence. That said, I think what it can do is tackle the kind of standing up for Scotland side of that nationalist valence argument, rather than devoting all the attention to independence. They're not touching it. You see glimmers of it when Ruth was leader, and you saw it with Douglas Ross recently. You saw a little bit of that, and certainly that was Murdo. When Murdo Fraser ran to be head of the Scottish Conservative Party, he made that case as well, and certainly a move in that direction would help. But they've got a heck of a challenge in terms of Brexit.
Okay, Richard.
So, from a Welsh perspective, we're always focused on Labour. I mean, we are the part of the UK who has to think about Labour all the time. It's worth reminding ourselves that Labour haven't won a majority of the votes cast in England since 2001. Even Michael Howard managed to outdo Tony Blair. Obviously, the electoral system meant that Labour won more seats in England than the Tories in that election, but nonetheless. So from a Welsh perspective and a Welsh Conservative perspective, as I said earlier, they've won every election in Wales since 1922, and they've got an English Labour problem. What do they do when Scottish Labour has kind of sunk and doesn't look as if it's coming back anytime soon, and when the red wall seats, which I see as a kind of what people are actually talking about as English identifying seats. There's a really strong national identity dimension to that, which people seem to ignore. So what the Welsh Labour do, and interestingly, one of the they also really struggle to get heard by the people around Starmer. I mean, Starmer is not he doesn't get devolution. Naturally, there's a lot of resentment at how slow the Labour leadership in London was in even congratulating Welsh Labour after their remarkable results in the devolved election in May. Interestingly, it's to Gordon Brown that he turns in order to come up with a policy for the UK rather than Mark Drakeford, even though, frankly, Mark Drakeford probably could say, well, I might have a sense of how this stuff works, guys, but he's just completely ignored. And so, I mean, what Labour seem to be trying to come up with is some kind of grand reform plan for the UK as a whole. Ilse and I have published a book earlier when was it, Ilse, last year? March last year, almost a year ago, which shows that, coming up with grand plans for constitutional reform for England is extremely difficult because, the answer that politicians would tend to like, which is some form of regional government or city regions or something, is something that the English population is deeply opposed to. What they want, which is treating England as a unit, is incredibly difficult in terms of the political architecture. I mean, if somebody asked me for a blueprint here, and nobody ever will, obviously, what I would say is actually, basically, you probably want to tidy up the devolution settlements for Scotland, Wales in particular. Justice isn't devolved in Wales. We've got the highest imprisonment rates in Western Europe in Wales and no way of doing anything about it. So you can tidy things up and basically stop digging the hole and trying to force people to choose between Cardiff and London and just hope that you can just let it calm down, because a big bang revision of the states just looks impossible to me.
Okay. John, some words on that?
Just very briefly, I mean, in terms of Northern Ireland, successive Westminster governments have managed to annoy unionists and nationalists, so I suppose there's a certain crude even-handedness there. I am fascinated by the DUP's relationship with Boris Johnson, because the DUP seems to keep coming back for more. I was there at the DUP conference in 2018 when Boris Johnson famously said that no British Conservative Prime Minister could or should preside over an Irish sea border, and then 1 year later agreed to do exactly that. Labour's position on Northern Ireland is interesting because it's very different from that in Scotland, where it would obviously campaign for the Union. Labour's official policy is to be neutral. It's up to the people of Northern Ireland. I'm not sure that will hold under Sir Keir Starmer, because when he was asked about this by BBC Northern Ireland's political editor, Enda McClafferty, a few months ago on it, he seemed that I think he wanted to enter the fray and was very pro-union in his sentiments, and you got the impression he'd be sort of like chomping at the bit to actually campaign for the Union in any such referendum. But Labour's policy is one of strict neutrality, which makes it very different from the position elsewhere in the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much. several things here on lots of pick up on Northern Ireland, which I'd like to pick up very quickly with you both, if I can, and indeed in terms of the some of the more kind of detailed points you made, both of you here. So I'll just try to share it out in that way with one eye on the clock. One of the questions which came up 2 or 3 times to Alva and John is, what if the Alliance Party comes second, okay, in these elections? Now, what happens then? What are the permutations that you think are most realistic at that point?
Logically, the party that comes second should be able to take the Deputy First Ministership, but Alliance won't be able to because they're in the wrong block. There are 3 blocks in Northern Ireland: Unionist, Nationalist or others. When someone's elected to the Northern Ireland Assembly, they have to designate as either Unionist or Nationalist or others. Alliance hate the term others, and they designate, I think, as one community, but they're classed as part of the others block. So let's say Sinn Féin becomes the largest party in Northern Ireland, then the Deputy First Minister needs to come from a party from the next largest block. So it would be the DUP that would have the nomination for Deputy First Minister. The others, there aren't many others in the Northern Ireland Assembly. Alliance have got 8 seats, and there's a couple of Greens in there and people for profit. So the block size would not allow Alliance, despite their second place, to take the Deputy First Ministership, and they're not going to get enough seats, I don't think, for a First Ministership. So blocks, the binary Unionist Nationalist bloc prevails in Northern Ireland.
Okay. Alva?
Yeah, and I'm pleased that there's been a question about this, because I'm planning to go home at some stage to report on exactly this, because it is really confusing, because then does that mean that you're looking at a Sinn Féin UUP First Ministership, Deputy First Ministership? How would Alliance respond to that? How would the DUP respond to it? I think these are questions we don't have answers to yet, but that's the technical issue there.
We will read with interest. Okay. Thank you very much. A couple of points here. Is the ambivalence, I mean, to either of you on my right, is the ambivalence of English voters to the Union due to the feeling that they're paying for devolution and better public services in other parts of the UK? What did you find when you did all the research you did?
Yeah, so there's a sense of grievance within the union. I mean, the union can be described as a union of grievance, and it's not just English grievance. I mean, it's kind of omnidirectional. Different parts of the union have a sense of grievance about other parts. And if you look at resource sharing, sometimes the least willing to share with each other are the Scots and the Welsh, who just don't want to share across with each other. And I think because they think, well, you've got devolution, sort yourself out. But in terms of England, I mean, there is a clear sense of English grievance, and that English grievance has a particular target, and that particular target is Scotland, among all the others. And it manifests itself as a sense that Scotland has undue access to resources and undue access to influence. And if, you know, one difficult thing about the Future of England survey is that when we tried to get money to do things, we were told, no, there's nothing interesting happening in England, so you don't get any money. And it took us a couple of years to put together the funding. So between when the devolution polling stopped in around 2003 and when we started in 2011, we don't know what happened in between, but we do know that English grievance kind of went through the roof. But the working hypotheses are that all of a sudden you had, in 2007, an SNP government that was making things free in Scotland. It wasn't really making new things free. It was just continuing to have things free that had already been made free by a previous Labour-led administration. But the fact that it was nationalists doing it appeared to capture the attention of the English media. But you also had Gordon Brown becoming Prime Minister. And those two things, I think, hit at the two senses of grievance and unfairness. The undue access to resources. You've got Nats making things free. They get far more free things than we do. And also undue access to influence. Look, they've even got they have their own devolution. They've even got the Prime Minister. You know, how is this fair? So that would be my...
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with all of that. I think it was interesting in the previous session, in one of the previous sessions, I forget which one, somebody reminded us of the 2015 general election campaign when the Conservatives very, very deliberately mobilised English grievance incredibly successfully against both the Lib Dems and Labour. And, you know, in our book, we talk a lot about that particular episode, and one of the kind of Tory strategists was unwise enough to say we were actually tapping at English grievance about Scotland.
No, it was the English don't like to be ruled. Sorry to cut you off. The English don't like to be ruled by foreigners, and then they went on and explained that by foreigners they meant Scots.
Yeah,
so they were talking.
Ailsa got particularly agitated when we found that. Anyway, so that is there. It's been mobilised incredibly successfully. If you all the accounts of the 2015 general election, the people involved are clear that this was a key element of it. Political scientists really struggle to talk about it because we often didn't ask the right questions in the surveys, but it was a key thing. And I think it's mobilisable again, potentially, because you've got this underlying sentiment that, public spending levels, it's unfair that Scotland has higher levels of public spending than in England, and there's an injustice, fundamental injustice there, and there's, they're foreigners after all at some level. So I think this is something, I think this will circle back to this. Again, it's a key card. Even though the Conservatives have got rid of English votes for English laws, even though they're wildly inconsistent on this stuff, it's there to be mobilised again.
Can I just pick up very quickly? This is from Keith Raffan, who knows a thing or two about politics in Wales and Scotland, and indeed at Westminster. Thanks for this, Keith. One of several questions, but just on your line there, Richard, that, Scottish Labour not coming back anytime soon.
Yeah.
And Keith is saying, well, in that case, what does Scottish Labour have to learn from the success of Welsh Labour?
Well, this is something that we discuss on a very regular basis. What I think the secret sauce of Welsh Labour is that they are very consciously not trying to alienate kind of the nationalist. They embrace it very clearly, and they've been. We've had this spike in interest in independence in Wales over the last 4 or 5 years. It's now pretty much standard for my Labour activist students in Cardiff, and I work in Cardiff, not Aberystwyth, to be pro-independence or pro-very radical constitutional change. And, what you get from Mark Drakeford and other Welsh Labour leaders at the devolved level, the Welsh Parliamentary Labour parties, is pretty anti-devolution. But at the devolved level, what they say is, we're still unionists, but the union as it is broken. It needs fundamental reform. We understand these sentiments. Scottish Labour, on the other hand, has basically purified its own voters, isn't it? In a sense, it's getting rid of those people who used to vote Labour and be pro-independence. Labour doesn't want those people anymore, which is kind of electoral insanity. Welsh Labour is not making that mistake.
Thank you very much. I'm acutely aware of the time, and that my good colleague on election night, Sir John Curtis, will be standing by to come and do his keynote in about half an hour. So what I'd like to do is try to wrap up. And because I'm a man of my word, and by the way, who was it earlier who said something here about me? I'm just looking for it. No, obviously I'm ignoring the bad ones. I don't know where Ricky is, but Ricky, he and I will know what's going on here. Thank you. I agree with you, certainly on the charisma point. And no, I wasn't a headmaster, but I'd have been a damn good one if I tried, okay? So, Paul Giles, who has 44 likes on the question, and it's because I don't want anybody whinging at me on the way out. I'm going to put the question, even though I suspect it's a bit of a tricky one, unless, of course, somebody is going to surprise us and bring a long list of stuff along which we can reflect on. The problem I have is who to go to first, and because Alva was, I thought, a bit of a show-off from the Northern Ireland stuff, she was so good, she's going to go first on this, okay, Alva? You're a victim of your stunning success, and I'm not going to say who I'm going to after that, it'll be unfair. So, Paul's question is, could any panellist identify at least one benefit of Brexit, please? Okay, so, and we're all ears, because there will be people who certainly would be very happy to underline benefits in the process, or indeed, as I discovered in an interview the other day, potential benefits, or benefits which are coming down the line. Okay, so this is a perfectly good and valid question, and I'm going to use this to tie up the session. And I've given you enough time to think now, Alva, haven't I, by just wittering on for about a minute, all right? So, can you identify at least one benefit that that you'd want to talk about? And in fact, whether you want to make it related to Northern Ireland, given what's going on, or a more general one, that's up to you.
Well, I gather they'll be coming any day now, these benefits of Brexit, because Jacob Rees-Mogg is on the case now. So I'd say well, let's watch Jacob to see. None are coming to mind, but I'm sure he has some up his sleeve very soon.
Okay. Next one is Ilse.
I would say that I think it means that a UK political class cannot feed misunderstandings about the influence of the EU on domestic affairs. I think it now has to come clean about the fact that actually we probably could have made those changes all along. We just chose not to in some cases. And then in others, do you know what? These are difficult decisions, and now we can't even blame other people for making them on our behalf. We have to make them ourselves, and we have to have an open and honest conversation about the benefits of different ways of doing things.
So the benefit for you is that it's actually illuminated that that area. Okay, Richard.
I'm from Anglesey, North West Wales, one of the poorest bits of the UK, with Holyhead being formerly a key transport hub to Dublin, and so no.
Okay. Remind me not to invite you again.
That wasn't the spirit of the question.
John, you have the last word.
Brexit has been fantastic for politics departments. We are chock full of
We like your style, John. Thank you very much. Just a thank you for all the questions. Okay, I didn't get through half of them, but thank you very much. And could we just say thank you to the panel who've been fantastic? Thank you very much again. Thank you. Now, I think we're just going to pause for 30 seconds or so, and I'm told that Sir John has been waiting patiently for a good 10 minutes, so I'm not going to upset him anymore. He's somebody I need to keep sweet. So we'll just we'll vacate the stage, and you just wait patiently for a second, and you will have Sir John Curtis with you in just a moment. But thank you very much for now. Thank you.